Good afternoon, students. Today's video lecture will be on Glittering Vices, the chapter on envy. Um, so there's a few general things that I want to say that I'm going to do that Dr. DeYoung doesn't do. So these are additions. These are things you will need to know for the final. And I hope they're things that you find instructive, illuminating, helpful in various ways. So I'll try to do roughly three different things for each lecture on the vices that are not included in the text. Okay, so one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to apply each one of the vices to a particular story in the Bible. What my hope is here is that you will see how the vices sort of can manifest themselves in various ways. You'll also see how using the vices, the history, the language of the vices, can provide a fascinating window into hermeneutics, into an interpretation of the Bible. And you can apply that also to interpretations of literature. So, Jane Austen, she's one of my favorite authors. Um, if you have a deep understanding of the virtue and vice tradition, Jane Austen's books come alive in ways that they just don't if you don't get that, because Jane Austen is actually writing in that tradition. She is self consciously writing in the virtue vice tradition. She's very aware of that tradition, and she's really a master at it. And so I'm going to apply the vices to the story of the creation and fall of humans in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and hopefully show you how these vices manifest themselves and how we can use them to illuminate various aspects of the Bible and then other pieces of literature. The other thing that I'm going to do, the second thing that I'm going to do or attempt to do, is I'm going to attempt to demonstrate how each one of the vices is a perversion of something that is by itself perfectly good. So the vices are not sort of novelties. They don't exist on their own. They depend on something else existing that is fine. And what the vices do is they pervert, they twist, tweak something that is by itself perfectly fine. So I'm going to try to talk about that. What is it that the vices are perverting? And we can have disagreements over that, and I'd love to engage in those kinds of disagreements. What precisely is the vice perverting? And in a lot of cases, it may be that there's a bunch of different things that the vice can pervert or twist or tweak. The third thing that I'm going to attempt to do with each one of the vices is provide you with ways of diagnosing yourself. Do you have tendencies, behaviors that are leading you towards the vice? And we'll try to talk about methods for remedy. So we'll do diagnoses and remedies in each one of these. And most of the time, my diagnoses, my exercises for diagnosis, and my exercises for remedy will be different from what Dr. DeYoung puts in the book. Not because I disagree with her, just because I think there's a number of different ways of approaching this. Okay, before we dive in, I do want to say one other thing. There is a gradation of wickedness that the vice tradition, the virtue vice tradition, there's a gradation of goodness and a gradation of wickedness that the virtue vice tradition really emphasizes and highlights. And it seems to me, based on my understanding of current psychology, that is relevant here. So there's stuff going on in positive psychology, stuff going on in cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. There's stuff going on in other branches, related branches, so cognitive science, neuroscience, that is highly relevant to this language of the vices. And one of the things that is very interesting is that, the vices, the vice tradition emphasizes that each one of our decisions, each one of our actions that we perform, The actions that we perform with intentionality, the actions we perform where it's goal oriented, the actions that we perform where our will and our intellect are involved. So we're choosing this particular course of action because it appears good to us, it's desirable in various ways. We want, the consequences of it, the feeling of it, whatever. The vice tradition, the virtue tradition as well, says that every single one of our actions that we perform, that is genuinely an action of ours. It's not just a blinking of an eye or the secretion of pancreatic fluid, but it's an action that I perform that is under the control of my will and my intellect. Every single action like that is morally evaluable, that is, has moral uh, features to it, and those actions start forming and shaping our characters. So the more and more I perform actions of that type, the more and more I become habituated to those types of actions, right? So the more and more I smile at strangers, the more and more smiling is just going to become natural to me. The more and more I hold the door open for people, the more and more that's just going to become natural to me. It's just going to become part of my character. I'm going to do it, it's going to become a habit of mine, second nature. And so the virtue vice tradition says, look, every single action that you perform, a genuine action, not the blinking of an eye or, the secretion of pancreatic fluids, every genuine action you perform is character forming. And so there's a gradation of wickedness. So, for example, Hitler didn't become Hitler overnight. Hitler slowly, through various types of actions, became that type of person, the type of person who could look at another human and not see humanity there. And the child molester, the thief, the habitual pathological liar. Typically speaking, unless there's some sort of mental illness or brain defect, but typically speaking, these persons are formed over time. Okay, so we'll keep that in mind as we go. It's a very important point. Right at the beginning of this chapter on envy, Dr. DeYoung talks about the movie Amadeus. If you've never seen the movie, I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful movie. And I will post on the blog for today, I will post a link to the clip that she refers to. And this is a clip that involves Salieri. Salieri, this is a true story. The movie is a little bit embellished at various points, but it's pretty close. Salieri was himself a composer, himself a wonderful musician, and he was also a kind of music critic. So he was able to recognize talent and goodness and beauty in others. And what's fascinating to me, so I'm going to highlight some things Dr. DeYoung doesn't really highlight here. What's fascinating to me is that Salieri is, in a sense, right? Maybe the following is true of Salieri. It seems to me it very well might be that at the time he might have actually been the greatest art critic in the world. By art critic, I mean someone who's able to recognize beauty, able to recognize great talent and amazing musical gifts. Salieri recognized that in Mozart perhaps better than anyone else in the world. He was better positioned to recognize beauty, to recognize goodness and great gifts and talent in others. Now, he didn't have that same level of talent, that same level of giftedness that Mozart had. But he had something else that Mozart didn't have, the ability to recognize those gifts in others. And so what's fascinating to me about this case is that in many instances, perhaps all instances of envy, the person who is envious often, they desire some feature, some quality of another person, and they fail to recognize the great gifts they have. Or maybe they recognize the great gifts they have, but they don't think they're as great as that other gift, right? So we need Mozart's, but we also need Salieri's. We need people to point us to Mozart's. We need people to help refine our tastes and help us to see beauty and great talent and giftedness in others. And so Salieri had this wonderful ability. He could write about music, he could speak about music in ways Mozart absolutely could not. And yet that gift wasn't as important. So oftentimes when you are struggling with envy, or if I'm struggling with attitudes of envy, there's a very good chance that what's happening is I'm neglecting some wonderful gift of mine. And instead, I'm valuing more highly some other gift of yours and diminishing the gift, the talent that I have. And so all of that just gets twisted, right? So there's a deep perversion of something going on here. I'll talk a little bit more about what the thing that gets perverted here. But that's a fascinating thing. And so this reveals a general feature of all of the vices. The vices are all, at least in the tradition, this is how they're understood, the vices are all perversions, as I said earlier, of something that is in itself perfectly fine. So, for example, sex in itself is wonderful, but there are millions of ways we can pervert it. And so we can say the same thing with everything. Possessions, right? Having a car, having a home, having some clothing. Nothing wrong with that, but I can pervert, this idea of ownership or possessing material objects. Those are fine. Those are wonderful things to do, but I can pervert it in a million different ways. And so the same is true for all of the vices. All of the vices will be perversions of something, and it's going to be important to recognize what that thing is. Now, this way of thinking about the vices, that they're all perversions of something that is by itself perfectly fine and good, that points to a very, very particular theory about the nature of badness or the nature of evil. When I talk about evil, hear that as synonymous with badness. Evil is just going to be bad things that humans do, okay? And the theory of evil that is being sort of assumed here or pointed at by the vices is called the privation theory of evil. And according to the privation theory of evil, evil or badness is a privation of something that is supposed to be there. So it's the absence. Evil or badness is the absence of some feature that a thing is supposed to have. So the classic example is blindness. Blindness. I think I talked about this in another lecture. Blindness is the absence of something that is supposed to be there. So my desk isn't blind even though it can't see. But my friend Ray is blind. The difference is Ray is the kind of being who is supposed to see but can't. My desk is the kind of being that is not supposed to see. So to attribute blindness to the desk is a category mistake. Or it's a joke, a stupid joke or something, right? But to attribute blindness to Ray is perfectly legitimate because Ray is supposed to see and yet he doesn't. And so the privation theory of evil says all instances of evil or badness, human action, all instances of badness are absences of things that are supposed to be present. So what that suggests is this: all instances of badness are parasitic upon instances of goodness. The goodness is more fundamental than badness. Goodness, in a sense, pre-exists badness. You can't have just pure badness on the privation theory of evil, because pure badness would be nothing. If it was purely evil, purely bad, there'd be nothing there to pervert. It would be the absence of something. So think about this in application to the Christian, Jewish, and Islamic tradition regarding Satan. So whether you agree with the existence of Satan or not, I don't care. You can think about Satan in a particular way. Satan is not pure evil. He's not pure badness. According to the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim tradition, Satan was created quite good. Satan is an angel who's been perverted into a demon. So Satan's nature is angelic, but he's perverted that angelic nature into something that is terrible. He's taken something good and perverted it, but the badness presupposes the goodness. The badness can't exist independently of that goodness. So another implication of this is that badness is actually not creative. Badness is destructive of the fundamental thing upon which the badness is parasitic. So the badness is a defect a perversion, a twisting, a tweaking of some awesome thing. It's a destruction of something that is good. Okay, it's a defect in something that is good. So badness isn't creative, it's not inventive, it's not imaginative. It's a defect. Okay, it's a perversion. So the vice tradition, generally speaking, presupposes this account. We'll talk about that in more detail later, but you need to understand, at least in a rudimentary way, the privation theory of evil. So another example is like a dartboard example. Aristotle uses something like this. So you can think of a dartboard, right? The center of the dartboard is very small. There's really, there's only just, a few ways of hitting the bullseye. But think about the ways there are to miss it, right? There's a billion, trillion, million ways of missing that dartboard, or of missing the bullseye. And the same is true with respect to badness on this tradition. There are a million ways to go wrong, and there's really only a very, very, very small number of ways to go right. Okay, so now let's talk in a little bit more detail about envy. I'm going to present you with some abstracted ways of thinking about envy, and then we'll look at some examples. Okay, so in general, envy is contrasted with covetousness and jealousy. So envy is not the same as covetousness. Envy is not the same as jealousy. Envy manifests itself, or envy is the following attitude. It's when you, or we'll use myself as an example, it's when I want something someone else has, and I want that person not to have it. Okay? So I want what someone else has, and I also want that other person not to have it. So there's two wants involved in envy. It's my desiring or wanting something that another person has. Usually it's some sort of character trait. It's some sort of feature of that other person. Their good looks, their sense of humor, their intelligence, maybe the honor they receive from others, the attention that they get from others. So I want that, and I also want them to fail to have it. So I don't want to share it. So not only do I want their sense of humor, but I also would really like for them to no longer have that sense of humor. I want to be as funny, and I want them to not be as funny. I want to be as good looking, and I want them to not be as good looking. I want to be as smart, and I want them to not be as smart. Okay, so there's two wants going on. So notice envy can be partially satisfied if one of those wants are satisfied. So if my sense of humor increases or becomes as noticeably effective as, say, Frank's sense of humor, then my envious desires, my envious attitude will be partly satisfied, but it won't be fully satisfied. Similarly, suppose Frank's sense of humor diminishes significantly. Maybe he's going through a depression, his wife just left him, something like that, and his sense of humor diminishes significantly. My envious attitude will be partly satisfied there too. Even if my sense of humor doesn't increase, but Frank's sense of humor decreases, I will find pleasure in that. I'll find some joy, some satisfaction in seeing Frank's status, this particular feature of his diminish. Okay. So here's a general way of thinking about envy. I'll use S here. S is just like a variable that stands for some sort of agent, some sort of human person, okay? Let's put it like this. S1 wants S2's X, where X stands for a possession or a feature of S's. S1 wants S2's X, and S1 wants S2 not to have X. So I want Frank's sense of humor, and I want Frank's sense of humor. I don't want Frank to have that sense of humor. I want Frank's level of intelligence, and I want Frank to no longer have that level of intelligence. I want Frank's good looks, and I also want Frank to diminish in his good looks. Okay, so that's the nature of envy. Covetousness is different from envy. Covetousness is where The person wants S's stuff or S's feature. He wants S's wife. He wants S's ox. He wants S's house. Wants S's car. So S1 wants S2's car, ox, wife, house, money, good looks, whatever. So covetousness is really more about possessions. It's focused more about the possessions someone has. And covetousness is often okay with with the other person still possessing it. Now, here's the real danger of covetousness. It leads to envy. So the reason you might think that the Bible in the commands, in the 10th commandment says, thou shalt not covet, is because covetousness is the gateway drug to envy. Okay? Covetousness is like the cough or, the initial signs of pneumonia, and envy is the pneumonia. Covetousness is going to take you to envy. Wanting what other people want. Desiring, or wanting what other people have, desiring what other people have. So it's very dangerous. Think in our own climate right now. Lots of talk about inequality in our culture. And much of the talk about inequality sounds dangerously close to envy. And so I'm worried about the way that we speak about this stuff. We need to be very careful about the language that we use in talking about attitudes that we're supposed to have. So look, inequality by itself is not a problem. Here's a great example. Suppose everyone in the United States was a millionaire, had at least $1 million in their bank account. Some people had 5 million, some people had 10 million, but everybody had at least $1 million. There'd be inequality, but it wouldn't be a bad inequality, right? This would be everyone's rich. Some people are richer than others, but everyone is rich. So inequality in itself isn't an issue. Furthermore, I'm talking about economics here, obviously, economic equality isn't something to be sought after, obviously. Case in point, suppose everyone in the United States was dirt poor. Suppose nobody had a nickel to their name. We'd all be economically equal. But that's not something we want. So it's not just mere equality we want, right? And it's not that inequality in itself is bad, right? We want, to have enough finances in order for us to live flourishing lives. Okay, we'll talk about this more when we get to greed, but it's important here. Covetousness and envy are related. Jealousy is different from envy and covetousness. The way Dr. DeYoung talks about it is that, here's my characterization. Jealousy is characterized in the following way. S has something, S loves that thing, and S fears losing it. So, I have a wife, I love my wife, and I fear losing my wife. I have children, I love my children, and I might fear losing my children. And so this is obviously different from envy, right? With envy, I don't have the thing that I'm wanting, right? And with envy, I want others that have that thing to no longer have it. Those are not features of jealousy here. All right, with jealousy, there's a fear of losing the thing that I have, and this, of course, can manifest itself in all sorts of negative ways. For example, if I think of my wife as a mere possession, right? I can treat her as a mere possession of mine, and then my jealousy is nasty. I can think of my children as mere possessions, right? And try to hold on to them as I might hold on to a car or a home or some material good. And then that starts to move into something terrible. I can also mistake what it is to lose something. So, you get all these stories from literature about fathers, being reluctant to give up their daughters in marriage, mothers being reluctant to give up their sons in marriage, right? So that can start turning into envy, right? So think of the mother whose son is getting married, and she sees that as losing her son. She's wrong. She shouldn't think of that as losing her son. So that's mistake number one. So she thinks of this as losing her son to this woman, and now envy can creep in because now she wants her son back. She wants, she wants the affection of her son. to be greater than the affection the son has for his wife. So she wants the son's affection, and she also wants the son's affection for the wife to diminish. Notice, see how jealousy now has twisted into envy. Okay, so jealousy isn't always bad, but it can quickly become bad, especially when our fear of losing that thing is mistaken. Okay. Um, a lot of other things fascinating here. I could talk about envy for ages. I won't do so. Um, Notice that envy generally falsely assumes that the feature desired cannot be possessed by all. In general, envy falsely assumes. So, for example, maybe I'm envious of Frank's good looks, and I think that only one person can be good looking. Well, that's absurd, right? Or I'm envious of Frank's intelligence. And part of the idea here is I've got this idea that only one person can be that intelligent or be that good in math or in biology or in philosophy. So there's no even need for me to care anymore. Screw it, I can't do the work Frank's doing, so I might as well not even try. Well, of course, these subject matters require communities. These subject matters require multiple people with multiple gifts, right? So think about Mozart and Salieri, right? Mozart needs an audience, right? He needs training. He needs people to say, nah, that didn't sound quite right. He needs people in order for his great gifts to flourish. And so envy falsely assumes that the thing that it wants, the desire, the feature that it's going after can only be possessed by one. Now, in many cases, in some cases, maybe it is true that only one person. There are some properties that are such that everyone can have them. So everyone could be intelligent, everyone could be deeply valuable, everyone could be lovable, everyone can have those features. But there are other features that it's not possible for everyone to have. And notice, and we're going to get to this. I'm just giving you a highlight here. Notice that the divine properties are most obviously like that. So there can only be one omnipotent being, being that has all the power. There can really be, I think we can give an argument for the claim there can really be only one omniscient being that knows every truth. There can really be only one creator of the universe. And so if I want those divine properties, if I want to possess the divine properties for myself, I'm going to have to dethrone God in taking up the throne. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. But envy, generally speaking, falsely assumes that the thing that it wants can only be possessed by one person. And so if I get that thing, you can't have it anymore. Notice also envy essentially involves comparison. Now, I think for our purposes here, the thing that gets perverted, the thing that envy perverts most obviously is comparison. Envy most obviously, it perverts comparison, and in perverting the comparisons that we go through in our minds between us and others, it thereby ends up perverting our own value. The value, right? My sense of worth, my sense of value. But it starts off with comparison. So I start comparing my looks, my sense of humor, my intelligence, my athletic ability. I start comparing that to others. And then I see that because others are better at some of those things than me, my value and worth goes down. So I think it starts off with comparison. So the thing that is getting perverted in envy is comparing ourselves to others. Now, it's important to note that comparison is not bad in itself. In fact, we have to compare ourselves to others in order to get on in the world. For example, I need to know, I need to take an honest assessment at my ability to work on cars. And I recognize that I don't have very good gifts in working on cars. And so I need then to be able to find someone who possesses those gifts so that when my car breaks down, they can work on it. So I recognize I suck at working on cars. Frank is awesome at working on cars. So I take my car to Frank to get it worked on. right? I had to engage in a kind of comparison there. Similarly, I recognize that I need advice on parenting. I need advice on being a husband. And so I find someone who's got good advice on being a good father and a good husband, and I seek them out. I recognize there are defects in my understanding of parenting and being married, and so I find someone who doesn't have those same defects in understanding. So, getting good advice, wise counsel, instruction from others is absolutely necessary for success in life. So, we have to engage in a kind of comparison. Now, the problem is that the envious person engages in comparison for the wrong reasons. So, the envious person sees their own value, their being lovable, as being dependent on being like another person. So I can only be valuable if I'm as funny as Frank. I can only be lovable if I'm as smart as Frank. And so, since I can't be like Frank, I just can't be as smart as Frank is with respect to math, then I'm no longer as valuable. I'm no longer as lovable. So the envious person is misunderstanding the nature of love, what it is to be loved, and what it is to love others. The envious person is perverting good comparison, perfectly legitimate comparison that is required for us to get on with life, honestly assessing our own strengths and weaknesses. The envious person thinks that the fact that they lack certain features shows that they also lack value. They lack worth. They're not as lovable. Um, this points, by the way, I think there's a fascinating case to be made here that the envious person really has a deeply God complex. They actually want all the features everybody else has. They're really, really, really unsatisfied with their own finitude. Their own finitude is part of the problem. Finitude, they're finite, they're limited. So my being envious is often a sign that I really just want to be God. I want all the features to the highest degrees possible. And the fact that you possess a feature that I don't possess irks me. It makes me angry. Okay. The envious person, this often results in hatred. Notice Salieri hates Mozart by the end of his life. Salieri has murderous attitudes towards Mozart by the end of his life. And the reason is fascinating, and this goes to something deep about love. Uh, the envious person, by the way, the literature talks about it in terms of the envier and their rival. The object of the envious person's hatred, or the object of the envious person's envy, is called the rival. So they see that person as a rival to their flourishing, to their well being. And the envious person thereby ends up hating the rival. Okay, now, in general, this makes perfect sense. And the reason it makes perfect sense is this. In general, the following seems true to me. If X is viewed by S, where S is just some person, if X is viewed by S as blocking S's happiness, then S will hate X. The object of our hatred is whatever blocks our own happiness. So I'll say it again. If X is seen by S as blocking or inhibiting S's happiness, then S is going to end up hating X. Okay? Now, in general, that actually makes perfect sense. It's when we mistake the object that is blocking our happiness. We think it's Frank, or Frank's intelligence or sense of humor. We think that it's somebody else's good job. It's somebody else's being honored that is blocking our happiness. We think that the thing that's blocking our happiness is our low bank account, or the thing that's blocking our happiness is our lack of having a mate, or lack of sexual pleasure, or lack of traveling the world. That's blocking our happiness. And then slowly we start hating persons who have those things, right? But in general, this makes perfect sense, right? So if something is genuinely an obstacle to my flourishing. It's something is genuinely an obstacle. Now, for the Christian, our flourishing is intimately, essentially connected with being in a right relationship with God through Christ. So, if something really does get in the way, let's suppose for now that the Christian is right. Of course, I think the Christian is right. In order for you to live a meaningful, flourishing, wonderful life, you have to be in a right relationship with God through Jesus. If something gets in the way of that, then you have to eliminate it. You hate it. That's hatred. Getting rid, cutting off, eliminating all those things that get in the way of a right relationship with God through Jesus. Now, the danger is when we mistake those things that get in the way of a right relationship with God through Jesus. Or, if you're not a Christian, when you mistake those things that get in the way of what you think is your great good, what you think is the thing that will make you flourish. Okay? When we make a mistake about those obstacles, we're in for some serious trouble. So if I think the obstacle to my own well-being and flourishing is Frank's intelligence, then I'm going to try to diminish his intelligence. I'll mock him. I'll speak badly about him to others. I want others to see him as foolish. I'll try to, at every opportunity, I'll try to cut him down in various ways, right? I'll try to knock down his intelligence, and I'll find great joy and pleasure if I do so, or if others do so, or if Frank suffers some great tragedy where his mental capacities diminish. Uh, but in general, the idea that whatever is seen by me as an obstacle to my ultimate good, to my ultimate purpose and well-being, in general, I'll hate those things. That makes perfect sense. In fact, I gave a talk just last semester. Some of you might have heard it at an AC. I've given that talk, versions of that talk elsewhere, that love and hate are intimately connected. I am going to hate those things that get in the way of my marriage, right? So if pornography gets in the way of my marriage, I gotta hate it. If another man gets in the way of my marriage, maybe I shouldn't hate him, but I'm going to hate the idea, right? I'm going to hate that action, the actions that are being performed. If money is getting in the way of me flourishing, I'm going to hate, a lack of money, things like that. Okay, so the problem with the envious, of course, is that they're making mistakes all over the board. The envious is making a mistake about what will, in fact, make them flourish. They're wrong in thinking that if they were just more intelligent, more pretty, more handsome, more funny, more wealthy, that they would somehow, that would make them flourish. That would make them happy. They're wrong about that. So they're wrong about what their well-being consists in. And then, of course, they're wrong about what the obstacles to their well-being are. So they're wrong on both fronts, and they hate the wrong things. They end up hating the wrong things. And you can see how this easily leads to hating God, to hating others. Easily leads to that, right? God, if only you had made me more intelligent. If only you had made me wealthier. If only you had made me whiter or darker or of a different gender. If only you had made me this way, right? And so I start hating God. If I'm not a Christian or a theist, maybe I hate my parents. I hate my education. I hate my upbringing. Or I hate you because you have those traits that I think I have to have in order for me to flourish. Okay, let's connect this now to the Genesis story. So the Genesis story that I'm going to focus on here is where uh, Satan comes and talks to Eve. Okay, so he tells Eve, notice there's all sorts of fascinating things that go on here, right? He says, has God really said you're not allowed to touch any of the trees? God never said that. Eve says, no, 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 God didn't say we're not allowed to touch any of the trees. We're just not allowed to touch any of the trees in the middle of the garden. Notice, boom, right there, Eve's already wrong. That's not what God said. So here we get a nice indication that Adam has screwed up. He didn't relay the command to Eve properly. It looks like, right? That's one, I think, good hypothesis. So Eve says, no, we're not allowed to touch any of the trees in the middle of the garden. That's not quite right. God said, you're just not allowed to eat of any of the tree, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's no provision there saying you're not allowed to touch it. And notice the tree of life is also in the middle of the garden. Okay, so Eve gets it wrong already. And then the serpent says to Eve, he says, you know, the reason God doesn't want you to do that is because he's afraid that you'll become like him. You're going to know good and evil in the way God does. And Eve says, ooh, that sounds good. That sounds awesome. I want to know good and evil the way God does. Hey, how come God knows good and evil in a God-like way, in a creator-like way, in a sustainer-like way, and I don't know good and evil in that way? That's not fair. I want to know good and evil in that way. So you can start seeing, I think it's plausible to think there's some envy going on here. Eve wants this feature of God. She wants to know good and evil in the way that God does. But now notice, the only way you can know good and evil in the way God does is if you are the creator, is if you are God, right? As if you are omniscient, omnipotent, if you are the sustainer, the creator of all things. That's the only way to know good and evil. So in wanting to know good and evil the way God does, Eve thereby has to want God to no longer know good and evil that way, because there can be only one God. There can be only one creator of everything. There can't be two creators of everything. There can't be multiple omnipotent beings. Okay, so Eve wants to know good and evil in the exact way God does, which implies that Eve wants to dethrone God, right? There's an implication here. So I think we see envy, right? Eve wants this feature that God has, and in virtue of the properties that God has, Eve has to want God to no longer possess that feature. Okay, so I think we get, at the very least, we get the beginnings of envy, right? Maybe there's some covetousness going on here. There's some envy, and the serpent is really sort of highlighting it. Ooh, God has this feature that that you should really want. You should really want that feature. Okay, lots of daughter vices of envy here, right? So envy brings forth all sorts of behaviors, right? Um, Hatred of others, self-hatred. Uh, this can lead, right? So my attitude towards others becomes one of hatred. Another daughter vice is taking pleasure in the downfall of others. There's a German word for it. I never know how to pronounce it accurately, so I'm gonna say it. You can mock me. It's like Schadenfreude or something like that. And it literally means uh, feeling pleasure in others' pain, in others' failures, finding pleasure and joy in others' failures. Think about tabloids. Think about, gossip columns. Envy results in gossip, right? A daughter vice of envy. So on our tree, your tree should have at the root pride. One of the branches of the tree now is envy, and some of the fruit of envy. One of the fruits of envy is hatred of others, hatred of self, gossip, back right backbiting, defamation, wanting to ruin another's character, murder. Think about people who murder out of envy, right? People talk about murderous envy, right? Um, Maybe some stalkers have this, right? They murder out of envy or something like that. Okay. So those are daughter vices. You need to know some of the daughter vices of envy. Okay. Now here's how do we cure this? Well, here's some ways of thinking about it. You might write down on a piece of paper a person that you have envied in the past or present. Have you ever felt kind of good about somebody kind of not doing quite well? Maybe getting somebody was the subject of ridicule in a class or in a community, in a group or something like that. Someone was mocked and it made you feel good. Someone failed an exam or struck out at the plate or missed the free throw, and you were like, yeah, you didn't want that person to succeed. Um, those are signs that your attitude is moving in the direction of envy. So if that is you, write down that person's name. Think about why you envy the person. What are the qualities that the person has is that you want? What does that make you feel about yourself? Is it an accurate view? Are you accurately understanding your own value and worth? Or are you placing your value and worth in features that are temporary, features that come and go? If that's what you're doing, then your value isn't stable. It has no stability. You want to recognize your own value and worth and the value and worth of others in such a way that it's a stable value. It doesn't come and go with the gain and loss of various features, wealth, good looks, intelligence, things like that. Now, Rebecca DeYoung says one way of thinking about or curing envy, of remedying envy, is to reframe our vision of the world, ourselves, God, and other people. She says get involved in things where there's a shared or common good, doing acts of love for others. Man, I think all those are great advice. Here's another one, and I'm going to post some other ones as well for you to do on your own. Another one is to pray for the person that you envy. This is how, in my own life, I think I actually have struggled with envious attitudes. And I can name the persons that I've struggled with envious attitudes towards. And one of the things that I try to do, and I need to do it more, is I pray for that person, and I pray for for the very quality that I'm struggling with in envy. I pray that that person's quality, maybe it's their intelligence, maybe it's the fact that they're getting stuff published more frequently than I am. And I ask God, I say, God, let's say it's Frank, I say, God, increase Frank's intelligence and his wisdom, or increase Frank's publishing ability, or increase Frank's bank account. Um, and half the time I don't really mean what I'm saying, maybe, and I'll tell that to God. God, I don't even really mean this, but help me to mean it. Change my heart so that I really do desire Frank to increase in those ways. And I'll tell you what, when I do that regularly, my heart changes. My heart towards that person changes. Now, it has to be done repeatedly, right? And I'm honest with God. If I don't really mean it, I say I don't really mean it, but I ask God to help change my heart so that I will mean it. Okay. And so part of what's going on there is a deeply biblical principle. It's found in Romans chapter 12, and it's this idea that I'm supposed to rejoice with others. Now think about the second greatest commandment in the Bible. The second greatest commandment in the Bible is this: you're to love your neighbor as though they are you. Now imagine if I loved Frank as though he were me, Frank's great gifts of intelligence, I would be just as excited about them as if they were mine. When Frank is rewarded with a publication, or Frank is rewarded with great honor and accolades at various events, if I was loving Frank the way I am commanded to love him, then I would be just as happy when he receives those honors and accolades as if it were me receiving them. And so praying for Frank in that way is a way to get me into that attitude, to rejoice at Frank's great gifts, to be joyous over his wonderful abilities. And that's the kind of person that I really want to be. I hope that's the kind of person you want to be.